It's Saturday, and welcome to another episode of PO Cubed, your chronological guide to Nintendo's handheld consoles. My name's DD Ash, and this week we're playing David Crane's The Rescue of Princess Blobette, F1 Race, Trump Boy 2, Aretha, and Pac-Man. Let's start the show. David Crane's The Rescue of Princess Blobette, DMG-RP. Developed by Imagineering and published by Jaleco in Japan, Absolute Entertainment in North America, and Nintendo in Europe. Back in the 80s and 90s, princesses were getting kidnapped all too often. It was the done thing, a court fad, if you will. Apparently, this even applied to amorphous blobs, as we see in the Game Boy exclusive sequel to A Boy and His Blob for the NES. If you've played that game, the premise here is the same, a series of sometimes intuitive, sometimes quite abstract puzzles that revolve around feeding your pet blob certain flavours of jelly beans, which cause him to morph into various apparatuses. So yeah, same old storyline, but quite unique gameplay mechanics. The controls take a while to get used to. Your character, Boy, moves based on momentum, so speeds up as he goes along, sliding a little when coming to a stop. You cycle through the beans with Select and throw them to your buddy with A. Pressing B whistles for Blob to come back to you, which, if he's morphed, will cause him to return to his neutral state. There is a bit of a learning wall to get over, not just with the controls, but figuring out what all the beans do. The game doesn't tell you this until you use them, so it's beneficial to write all these down. For instance, the first one that you're shown is Licorice, which turns Blob into a ladder. There's no intuitive way to remember that. You could use initials, of course, but then there are lime beans too, which make Blob into a key, like key lime. Cola makes a bubble. Tangerine makes a trampoline. Oh hell, I don't know, just write them down. I'm not going to go through them all because there are lots of funny and clever devices to solve puzzles, which you'd enjoy more by discovering them, and I implore you to stay away from an FAQ unless you're completely stuck. Anyway, try everything, even if it makes no sense, because, come on, you're feeding jelly beans to a scrotum with a face, so clearly reality has no place here. You do have a limited number of beans though, so can trap yourself if you run out. Blob doesn't move on his own. You need to summon him by whistling, and he'll then move to your location. It can occasionally be tricky to get Blob in the position you need him in, as he can't be on the same space as you, so often you get pushed out the way. I've been pushed into spikes a couple of times because of this. As well as rescuing the eponymous Blobette, there are 18 treasures to collect, none of which really do anything other than garner points. Also lying about are coins, that upon collecting 5 will give you an extra life. You start with 5 lives, and Boy is kind of fragile. Falling too far kills him, as do these little invincible worm things. Overall, the game looks alright. There's a lot of repetition in backgrounds, and everything is simply drawn, but the animations are really nice. The characters have a cartoonish charm to them, as does the music. Sadly, there's only one song, and it kind of sounds like the Indiana Jones theme, but it's well composed enough to not get too annoying. Some of the sound effects in the game override it in such a way that only half the channels of the song play, which make it sound really weird, but the effects themselves are clear. The wolf whistle really does sound like one, and the crash that these stomper things make is quite foreboding. The Rescue of Princess Blobette, or to give it its full name, David Crane's A Boy and His Blob in The Rescue of Princess Blobette, is actually a delightful title with tons of charm and tongue-in-cheek humour. It's cool that the game is a new adventure rather than just being a port of the original. If you can get past the controls, which aren't bad, merely unusual, there is a lot of fun to be had here. It feels almost like a cosmic space head or, dare I say it, Monkey Island. Recommended if you want a clever and humorous puzzle game that's not limited to one screen.
Up to 4 guys can play each other at the same time. Whoa, make a crash! Use the turbo, man. Number 3's outdistanced him. This guy's got his own race. Whoa, right! In his own screen and his very own view of the race. No, he's got quick. I don't know what he said was. I don't know what he said. Anyway, 4-player adapter things included. F1 Race for Game Boy from Nintendo. Round up your posse and check it out.
F1 Race DMG-F1, developed and published by Nintendo. There were many games that were loosely based on Formula 1 racing. Some were mere nomenclature than anything close to a simulation. But the first one that many of us were exposed to, and undoubtedly the first that springs to most people's minds, is Nintendo's F1 Race. I was something of a fan of the sport in the 90s, before it completely lost its way and became the snooze fest it is nowadays, and this is not at all how I remember it. Racing games of the time were mostly either top-down or a third-person perspective, with a static car and moving backgrounds. This is the latter, and the overall look of the game is standard for the time. If you've played something like Outrun or Chase HQ, then F1 Race is not dissimilar. It's not as nice to look at as it could be. There are no inclines of any kind, and the backgrounds look pretty drab. The foregrounds are quite clever, as the striped ground either side of the track changes contrast depending on your speed. At low speeds, it's white and black. Increase up and the black changes to a dark grey, changing to a light grey and white at the highest speeds. This really gives a feeling of pace and is a very nice effect. Strangely, if you play this on a colorized palette, the ground can sometimes look like it's changing colors. There's no gear shifting in the game, you just press A to accelerate and B to brake. You know how this works. Pushing up on the D-pad allows you to use Nitro Boost for a finite amount of time, indicated by a fuel gauge on the HUD. You're given a pretty generous supply too, as all races are only 2 laps and you can't really use the boost on the corners. When boosting, the feeling of speed becomes really prevalent. Flames come out the back of your car and you get this awesome whirring sound that could double up as a jet plane. The draw distance isn't superb, and often you need to brake in good time to make some of the corners, but fortunately you're given a satellite map feature that shows both you and the first place CPU on it, and it's pretty accurate. Pay attention to this if you can so that you can plan your boosts and braking zones accordingly. There are 2 different cars to choose from. Car B is faster, but only has a small nitro tank, and the higher top speed makes it harder to corner. I just chose Car A all of the time, as some of the less tight corners can be taken without having to decelerate, which more than makes up for the lower top speed. If you crash out, there's little chance of you having enough time to come first. As you might expect, the opponents never crash. You need to come first to progress to the next race, which is definitely not how an F1 season works. Aside from the championship season, there is also a time trial mode, with a save battery included in the cartridge that enables you to save your fastest laps. This was quite a thing back then, you understand. Being able to save your game was actually a selling point. F1 Race is not a technical marvel by any means, but for the time it was fun, and very popular, not least for the use of a 4-way adapter that meant you could race with 3 of your friends too. Some cameos from famous Nintendo mascots, including Link's and Samus's first appearances on the Game Boy, only added to the charm. Trump Boy 2 DMG-T2J, developed and published by Pack-In Video. Have you ever seen a sequel released so soon after the original? Less than 6 months after the first Trump Boy game was released, we have a second one. It's a sequel only in name, really. It's actually more of a remake. There are a lot of recycled parts here. 3 games available again, the first of which is the same as the original Daifugo. However, the AI has been rebalanced, making the games a bit fairer. They still seem to gang up on you to a degree, and the graphics are a lot nicer to look at. The music is just as annoying, more so actually, unless you like the entertainer, and mostly recycled, but at least the visual aesthetics have vastly improved, with some cute looking animals featuring among the opponents you can choose. The second game has been replaced by a version of Uno, similar to what we saw in Card Game. The third game was a massively unfair matching game before, where it seemed the CPU already knew where the pairs were. Thankfully, that's totally gone, in favour of a rendition of the game Parliament, which is another discard your entire hand before the others game, but at least it's better than Nervous Breakdown was. So you may be wondering exactly what the point of Trump Boy 2 was. Why was a game barely changed and re-released within half a year of its initial run? It was actually a kind of launch title for the October 9th release of the 4-player link cable adapter, similar to the game in the previous review. At the time, it was this or F1 Race. I know which one I'd choose. Aretha DMG-A1J, developed by Japan Art Media and published by Yanoman. A conundrum I've long wondered about is the reluctance in the 80s and 90s to release RPGs in the West. I appreciate I'm looking at things through a modern-day lens, but when you have even Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest seen as niche markets, it's no wonder there were so many other lesser-known franchises that we missed out on entirely. And it's a real shame, especially when coming across something like Aretha, a very obviously brilliant Game Boy trilogy that would eventually spawn 6 titles across all systems. Now, I will qualify my obviously brilliant statement by saying it has all the hallmarks of an excellent game. Whether I'm accurate with that is not definite, as Aretha is not the easiest game to play with a subpar knowledge of Japanese. This title, more than normal, there is a lot of text. Fortunately, the combat system is your traditional turn-based deal, and this one works better than most. Despite this being one of the earliest uses of kanji on the Game Boy, games before now relied on the easier-to-code phonetic systems of hiragana and katakana. Do persist if you can with the reading, as the storyline and the character development is replete with the utmost charm. Aretha is the name of the kingdom in which the game takes place, found on the continent of Artera. As you might suspect, the similarity of the names of the two places causes enough confusion on its own. King Leparton bestowed on his 2 daughters each a ring, 1 gold and 1 silver, resembling cat's eyes, and allowed his court wizard to bestow on them magical blessings. However, at that very moment, the evil demon Lord Howard invaded Aretha and kidnapped one of the princesses. The defending army fought valiantly but were ultimately defeated, leading the king to seal the Arethan shrine and send his remaining daughter down a river, Moses style, in a basket. That daughter was raised by an old man named Floyd, and is the girl Materia whom you play as 10 years later, with the mission of defeating Howard and saving the world. The game is not a gentle one. Immediately, you'll need to grind to get anywhere, and it's not particularly simple. Make sure you save and replenish health between each and every battle for at least the first few levels. You'll die for sure should you come across 2 or 3 enemies at once. You have to persist and pick off the single targets until you're stronger. This will probably be the case in each new area you visit. Aretha is a slow-paced, patient grind that requires you to give a chunk of your time to. However, the game is good enough to give you hints as to when you're at the right level. Once you reach the sweet spot, random encounters will slow down to the point that they barely ever happen, meaning you'll be free to explore. Anyone who's gone back through Mount Moon without rappels later in the game knows the beauty of such a quality of life improvement. Bloody Zubats. The world map is admirably large, with the overworld being decently varied. This doesn't extend as much as I'd like to the dungeons, which feel a little repetitive. There are a lot of them, and whether they're disguised as fortresses, castles or caves, they all amount to much the same thing: unnecessarily extended mazes, with rewards few and far between. You're going to want to get to the stage where the random encounters have stopped for that particular area, because otherwise they're incredibly arduous treks. Caution is the key to progression. Expect to game over regularly. Every conflict could spell your doom. Save regularly, which you can do at any city. This is especially true while Materia is on her own. She doesn't get magic until much later, meaning you don't even have a healing spell until you find a partner. Materia is a lonely lass at first, to the point where she can self-talk, a kind of hint system, where Materia will chat to herself, wondering what she should do next. This became the party talk mechanic that you frequently see after this in other RPGs. So desperate for friends as she is, there's even a capture mechanic whereby you can persuade a monster to fight alongside you. It's pretty naff though. They'll only join you for one battle and seem somewhat reluctant to fight, as they're immediately weaker than the enemies around you, meaning you probably won't use this much. Let's take a moment to admire what feels so special about Aretha. It truly is a remarkable looking game. The attention to detail is quite astounding, bearing in mind this was only 1990. The Final Fantasy titles came close to this, but realistically Aretha goes above and beyond even that. Bear in mind too that developers Yanaman didn't have the resources or experience that the Square development teams had. In fact, this was Yanaman's first game ever. Many early developers had a problem manipulating Game Boy code into half-playable RPGs. Not these guys. They hit it out of the park straight away. Localization when?
Now from Atari, a great new video game, Pac-Man. To stay alive, Pac-Man must eat power pills, vitamins, and ghosts.
I'm putting a stopper on now.
But beware, the ghosts fight back.
You've got 2 minutes.
Pac-Man's appetite is insatiable. To keep ahead of the game depends on your skill at feeding him.
Supper is served.
Pac-Man, the all-consuming video game, only from Atari.
Pac-Man DMG-PC, developed and published by Namco. The original, but not really, maze game with overtones of drug addiction made its first foray of several on the Game Boy in 1990 by the creators Namco themselves. Everyone knows how to play Pac-Man. You run around a darkened room to electronic bleeps and waka waka noises, munching pills. This was all the rage in the rave scene of the early 90s, but of course Pac-Man predates this somewhat, first appearing in arcades in 1980. Like I say, Pac-Man is evidently one of the most iconic games in history, with thousands of variants and rip-offs on pretty much every machine ever. If, miraculously, you've never played a version of this game, firstly, you're probably 5 years old and reading at a level way above your age. Well done. And secondly, I would suggest this is not the one to start with. One of the biggest hurdles to get over when porting a game down to the small Game Boy screen is making the game fit properly. And sadly, this wasn't really achieved. One of the necessities, and a mainstay in practically every other version, is the maze being visible on one single screen. That way, you can see all you need to accomplish and where the bad guys are at all times. The Game Boy version of Pac-Man immediately shoots itself in the... well, Pac-Man doesn't have feet, but it's pretty stupid to try and spread the maze out across multiple screens. I know it's only a small screen to work with, but it can still be done. It's a bit of a design flaw, especially seeing as how such a huge swathe of the screen is taken up by the scoreboard and stuff. You can easily lose a pellet. You can sometimes leave one somewhere in the maze and then have to drift around looking for it, which is no good if you're being chased. This game is tough enough when you can see all of the pellets, but having to keep track of where you've been as well adds an unnecessary level of difficulty. Press right on the title screen and you can play in half-size mode, which does allow you to see the whole course. However, now the dots are single pixels. This is fine on a full-screen emulator or an SP, but try playing that on a DMG screen. Maybe I'm being pernickety, but Namco originated this game, so they should know what you need to do to make such a simple concept work. There's a really strange bug that's a detriment to the gameplay as well. Sometimes, when in power pellet mode, Pac-Man can just go straight through a ghost. With such a small amount of programming necessary, this game should be absolutely solid, with no bugs in sight. This happens with an alarming regularity too, so I'm sure it's not a one-off. It appears to happen most often if you've just eaten one ghost and there's another right behind it. But I mean, it happens at least once per level to me. More rigorous testing was certainly needed. Sound-wise, the game is certainly identifiable, but for some reason the noises we're accustomed to sound really grating in this version. I don't know why that is. Maybe Pac-Man always sounds irritating, but when the gameplay is good, you don't notice it as much. There are plenty of other versions of Pac-Man that you could choose over this one. There's even, and I hate to say this, a Game Gear version that I prefer. Admitting that leaves me feeling sullied and unusual, so I'm ending this review and going for a shower. Thanks for listening to the Portable Power Podcast. If you want to support the show, the best way to do so is on Patreon at patreon.com/portablepowerpodcast. Or subscribe on the YouTubes. We have daily uploads Monday to Friday, where you can watch me suck at the games as I talk about them. You can tweet me at POCubed or on any of the other socials you might expect. Thanks again and have a great weekend.